Only in a few short hours, a gunshot that seemed like a show of force in the Gulf of Oman waters turned into a pivotal move that shook and shifted the entire Middle East chessboard. President Donald Trump stood before the cameras and declared decisively that the United States would no longer play the warning game with Iran, and then the order was issued. An Iranian flagged cargo ship was shot through its engine room and seized in the open sea as a cold reminder of American naval power. In that moment, Washington believed they had just reestablished the rules of the game. But what they did not anticipate or deliberately ignored was that those rules had changed long ago, only waiting for a trigger to explode. Iran did not respond with words, did not hold press conferences, did not issue threats. Instead of the familiar statements on international forums, they replied in the only language their opponent was forced to listen to: firepower. In less than 3 hours, the sky over the Gulf of Oman lit up with streaks of hypersonic fire. Two American destroyers, symbols of absolute naval superiority, burned amid the night waters. And while Washington had not yet recovered, the second wave descended deep into Israeli territory, directly targeting the most critical air bases, the places where trust was placed in the F-35, and the multi-layered defense shields that Tel Aviv had once proudly claimed were impregnable. This was no longer a limited collision. This was a declaration. A regional power had just stepped out of the shadow of restraint, proving that it could strike directly, strike quickly, and strike at the exact points its opponents never thought would be touched. Meanwhile, in Washington, the tough rhetoric began to fall out of step with the reality burning on the battlefield. And in Tel Aviv, the defense systems once praised as an absolute shield revealed deadly gaps. So, what really happened in less than 24 hours? How did one decision to open fire and one ship trigger a chain reaction that shook both the U.S. Navy and Israel's strategic bases? How long had Iran been preparing for this scenario, and how far were they willing to go? With the ceasefire deadline less than 72 hours away, was this the opening shot for an all out war, or the moment marking the collapse of an old order? Welcome to the U.S. Power Watch channel. What you are about to hear is not fragmented pieces of news. This is the entire picture, carefully linked according to the true flow of power, of calculations, and of the stakes that may have to be paid for with an entire region and perhaps the whole world. The opening shot when Trump chose force over diplomacy, less than 24 hours before the entire Middle East erupted. The world was still lulled by familiar phrases: negotiations, de escalation, restraint. Washington spoke of peace on paper. Diplomatic channels were revived, and a fragile ceasefire agreement still hung precariously like a thread about to snap. But behind that shell was a cold reality. Everything was already at the threshold of explosion, only waiting for a touch, and that touch came from the White House itself. An Iranian flagged cargo ship named Tuska appeared in the Gulf of Oman waters. The U.S. accused it of transporting missile components. A warning was issued, an order to stop was given. But when the ship did not comply, Donald Trump did not choose to wait, did not choose diplomacy. He chose to pull the trigger. The 5-inch naval guns roared in the night. Fire tore across the sea surface. Shells flew straight into the engine room, carving a fatal hole into the ship's hull. Tuska shook like a wounded beast. Thick black smoke billowed up, glowing red metal amid the night waters. Within minutes, the ship was turned into a drifting wreck, completely out of control. And then the next step unfolded coldly, as if it had been written in advance. U.S. Marines boarded with guns pointed at the Iranian crew, seizing and controlling every person and taking over the ship. A perfect, fast, clean, and decisive show of force. A slap in the opponent's face in waters that America believed were still under its absolute control. Trump immediately stepped forward to claim that moment, his familiar tough tone not hiding his confidence. America would no longer be weak. Anyone who challenged it would pay the price. He believed he had just sent a deterrent message, a blow strong enough to force Iran to back down, a move to pull Tehran back to the negotiating table in a position of weakness. But it was right here that the entire calculation began to slip off its orbit. Washington saw a ship that needed to be stopped. Tehran saw a national symbol being shot right in the middle of the sea. Washington thought this was escalation control. Tehran understood this as an insult that could not be swallowed. And that difference was the most dangerous thing in any confrontation. Because when one side believes they are setting the pace while the other side feels they have just been pushed into a corner, the reaction will never stop at a balanced level. Trump chose force at the most sensitive time, when diplomatic channels still existed, when the ceasefire deadline had not yet hit bottom, when the opponent was no longer the Iran of 10 years ago. This was an Iran that had endured, accumulated, observed, and waited. An Iran that no longer responded from the shadows, but was ready to answer with direct firepower. The moment Tuska was shot through was not just a military event, it was a red line erased, a signal that the game had entered a new phase where words no longer carried weight, where every message had to be written in fire. Trump believed he was forcing the opponent to retreat, but in reality, he had just opened a door that the other side had long prepared to step through. And when that door burst open, there would be no turning back. Just a few hours later, the sky over the Gulf began to light up with streaks of fire that did not belong to naval guns. No more warnings, no more negotiations, no more gray zones, only a reaction hurtling forward at a speed that Washington could not understand in time, could not stop, and no longer had the ability to control. The shot at Tuska was not the end of an action. It was the command shot for a series of retaliatory strikes that, once started, forced all sides to charge forward to the end. The retaliatory strike when Iran turned the Gulf of Oman into a message written in fire. There was no statement, no press conference, no warning of any kind issued. While Washington was still drunk on victory with the seizure of the Tuska ship, on the other side, a machine had been quietly, coldly, and terrifyingly precisely activated. And then, at the exact moment the Americans believed they were in control, the Gulf sky suddenly lit up. At around 2100 local time, the early warning systems of the US and Israel simultaneously flashed. Heat signatures surged, strange trajectories appeared. Not one, but multiple launch points simultaneously from deep inside Iranian territory. Columns of fire tore through the night, pushing giant metal blocks into the atmosphere at speeds that radar could only briefly detect before losing track. There was no time for debate, no space for speculation, only one conclusion. Iran had opened fire. Hwasong-18. The weapon, once mocked as political posturing, now streaked forward like an unmistakable response. Solid fuel missiles launched quickly, without long preparation, carrying maneuverable re-entry vehicles that every interception system feared. They climbed near the edge of space, then suddenly adjusted trajectory, diving at hypersonic speed, performing lateral maneuvers at maximum speed of Mach 20, tearing apart every pre-programmed defense algorithm. The targets were not random. USS Princeton, the very ship that had just fired, and Tuska were locked as the first strike points. A bright streak cut across the sky, then a terrifying flash tore open the sea surface. The warhead detonated against the hull, carving a giant fatal hole. Fire erupted from inside like a beast being disemboweled. Fuel lines ignited. The ammunition magazine triggered a chain explosion. The hull shook with heavy thuds. Minutes earlier, it had been a symbol of power. Now the ship gradually listed, flames licking along the hull. The crew in panic, desperately fighting the fire. But that was not all. The second salvo descended almost immediately. USS John S. McCain, the destroyer equipped with the advanced Aegis system, became the next target. Defense systems activated, interceptor missiles launched, radar scanning at full power. But what was coming down was not an ordinary target. The Hwasong-18 re-entry vehicles altered trajectory in the final seconds, evading all interception windows, and then the impact occurred. A deafening explosion, the ship's superstructure was torn apart. The command center plunged into darkness as the electrical system was knocked out almost instantly. Thick black smoke poured from multiple holes. Communication signals flickered. The ship lost combat capability after just one single hit. That was the moment all illusions collapsed. For decades, America had believed its Navy was impregnable in the Gulf, that its Aegis destroyers with multi-layered defenses could handle anything Iran possessed. But that night, that belief was torn apart right on the surface of the Gulf of Oman, not by a prolonged mass attack, but by two clean, cold strikes sufficient to expose all weaknesses. Iran did not fire to make noise. Iran fired to send a message so clear it needed no explanation. You shot at our ship, we shot directly at your ships. No proxies, no proxy forces, no hiding in the shadows. The retaliation was direct, public, and so highly symbolic that it could not be denied. While the two destroyers burned in the night sea, urgent signals flooded into U.S. Central Command. Rescue helicopters took off. Fighter jets were scrambled. Remaining warships accelerated and dispersed formation. But all those reactions shared one common point. They occurred after the strike had been completed. America was no longer the side giving orders in that moment. America was the side reacting, and that was the real blow. Not just the fire on the hulls, not just the casualties, but the shift in the balance of initiative. In a single counterstrike, Iran had proven three things Washington did not want to admit. They had the ability to hit mobile naval targets at long range. They were willing to use that capability directly against U.S. forces. And most importantly, they knew exactly when to act to turn a show of force into a moment of humiliation. That night, the Gulf of Oman did not just burn, it reflected a new reality, a reality in which no American action was immune to the price that had to be paid. And while the columns of black smoke still rose from the two destroyers, one thing began to become clear in every command center. This was not the end. This was only the opening move. Rain of fire descended on Israel. Iran brought the war right to its opponent's doorstep. If the strike in the Gulf of Oman was a warning, then what happened just minutes later was truly the cold declaration from Tehran. Not stopping at making the U.S. Navy burn in the ocean, Iran did what Washington and Tel Aviv had believed for many years would never happen, bringing the war straight into the heart of Israeli territory, striking directly at the most heavily protected bases, where not only the most advanced equipment, but also American soldiers themselves were present. Less than 30 minutes after the first strike, the sky was torn apart once again. From mobile launchers deep inside Iranian territory, a series of Wahad-18 missiles left their pads, rising straight up like living columns of fire, racing into space, then disappearing from observation. This was no longer a single response. This was a calculated, rhythmic series of actions with no signs of panic or outburst. Iran did not strike to vent anger. Iran struck to redefine the rules of the game. This time, the targets were not vulnerable points. Iran chose the places considered the heart of Israeli air power, Nevatim Air Base, home to the most modern F-35 squadrons, the pride of Tel Aviv, and the backbone of all air campaigns, Tel Nof Base, the logistics and refueling center and strategic units with direct coordination with U.S. forces. These were not just military targets. These were symbols, and Iran had aimed straight at those symbols. When the Wahad-18 re-entry vehicles dove down, Israel's entire defense system was immediately activated. Arrow, David's sling, American interceptor systems all launched into the sky. The problem was not the number of interceptors. The problem lay in what was coming down. The hypersonic maneuvering warheads did not follow familiar trajectories. They swerved, changed direction, breaking every prediction. The defense algorithms built for stable flight paths suddenly became slow and out of rhythm. Then the unavoidable moment occurred. A flash lit up over the Negev desert sky. Then an explosion slammed into the ground like a giant hammer blow. A warhead struck the aircraft shelter area at Nevatim. Fire erupted fiercely. Fuel burned, ammunition exploded in a chain reaction. The F-35S symbols of the technological superiority Israel had been proud of for decades were swallowed in a sea of flames. Not in the air, not in aerial combat, but right on the ground, right inside the bases, considered the safest. Just minutes later, Tel Nof also received a similar blow. A precise strike on the tactical infrastructure area. Buildings collapsed, electrical systems paralyzed, a transport aircraft on the runway burned fiercely. Thick black smoke billowed up, covering the night sky. Alarm sirens sounded throughout the base. Soldiers ran in panic, seeking shelter. The wounded were dragged away in emergency lights. There was no longer calm, no longer confidence, only chaos. What made this strike terrifying was not only the level of damage, but the message it carried. Iran did not just counterattack. Iran chose the right time, the right targets, the right method to force the opponent to understand that this war was no longer within their control. You shot at our ship at sea. We struck directly at your bases on land. You thought you could keep the war far away. We brought it right to your doorstep. This was not the action of a cornered party. This was the action of a nation that had prepared this scenario for many years. Every missile carried not only explosives, but also a clear message. Iran was no longer a passive target. Iran was a force capable of simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts with accuracy and speed that made even the most advanced defense systems falter. While the fires continued to spread at Nevatim and Tel Aviv, an undeniable reality began to emerge. The red lines that Washington and Tel Aviv had once drawn had been erased. Iran did not just cross them, they trampled them. And with every column of smoke rising from those bases, an old illusion was also being burned away that technological superiority could guarantee absolute safety. But what was even more terrifying was that this was not the final blow. This was only the next part in a chain of reactions that had been triggered. And when Tehran had proven they could strike both at sea and on land in the same breath, the question was no longer whether they would stop. The question was how far they would go. The steel shield was torn apart. When the F-35, Arrow, and THAAD revealed their deadly vital points, after those twin blows at sea and on land, what collapsed first was not the aircraft shelters or the blackened ship hulls. What shattered was the belief that Washington and Tel Aviv had built for decades, that they always had an invisible shield of absolute protection, that no matter what the opponent did, their technology would still be enough to block, control, and extinguish it. But in just one night, that entire structure was holed through right before their eyes, not by overwhelming numbers, but by cold precision. Look straight at the nature of this shock. America did not lack weapons. Israel did not lack defense systems. On the contrary, they possessed what were considered the military elite of the West. Aegis, multi-layered radar destroyers, standard interceptor missiles. On land, Arrow, David's Sling, THAAD, a dense network designed to turn the sky into an absolute no-go zone for any missile daring to intrude. And behind it all was the pride called the F-35, the symbol of air superiority in modern warfare. But that night, all of them revealed a truth they did not want to face. When the Wahad 1-8 dove down, those systems did not collapse completely. They still operated, radar still scanned, interceptor missiles were still launched, but they were one beat too slow. And in modern warfare, one beat slow means losing the exchange. The Iranian reentry vehicles did not fly in the way the defense systems were programmed to handle. They did not go straight, they were not stable, they maneuvered at speeds where any calculation error became a deadly gap. When air defense batteries locked on, the target had already changed direction. When interceptor missiles approached, the warhead had already deviated from the predicted trajectory, and then in the final moment, everything became meaningless. That was why the strikes on Nevatim and Tel Aviv did not only cause physical damage, they were like a knife flipping the entire Israeli defense doctrine upside down. A nation that had built its security on two pillars, early detection and long-range interception. But when the opponent could bypass both, the distance between safety and being hit was measured only in seconds. And the shock ran even deeper. The F-35S were not shot down in the air. There was no dogfight, no chance for counterattack. They were hit right on the ground inside the best protected bases. That was not only material damage, that was strategic humiliation. Because it proved one thing: air superiority meant nothing if you could not protect the places where your aircraft took off. On the American side, the strike on the destroyers hurt even more because the Navy was not just a combat force, it was a symbol, an affirmation that wherever American ships were present, that place was under Washington's control. But when an Aegis destroyer burned in the Gulf of Oman, when its multi-layered defense system was penetrated in a single blow, that symbol shattered instantly. What Iran did was not to completely destroy the opponent's systems. They did something far more dangerous. They proved that those systems were not perfect and that just one small vulnerability exploited at the right moment could put the entire defense structure into a passive position. This was precisely the moment when the psychological balance began to tilt, because from now on, every time radar detected an unknown signal, every time the alarm sounded, what appeared in the minds of American and Israeli commanders was no longer confidence, but the question, can we stop it this time? And once that question existed, it meant absolute superiority no longer remained. Iran did not need to destroy every target. Iran only needed to do one thing: force the opponent to doubt their own shield. And that night, they succeeded not by overwhelming numbers, not by luck, but by preparation, patience, and a strike delivered at a ruthlessly precise moment. The columns of smoke still rose from the Negev, fire still burned at sea, but what was burning most fiercely was not there. It lay in the very belief of Washington and Tel Aviv. Once that belief was burned, every subsequent decision would no longer stem from strength, but from the fear of paying the price. And that was the real victory Tehran was aiming for. The White House was suffocating while issuing urgent orders, but had no moves left. Smoke still billowed from the Gulf of Oman, fire still burned in the Negev desert. But the place that truly fell into emergency was not the battlefield. It was in Washington. In the closed rooms, once accustomed to giving orders to the world, the atmosphere thickened, not from lack of information, but from too much bad information pouring in at once. Donald Trump was furious, not a political kind of anger, but the reaction of someone who had just realized his move had not gone in the calculated direction. He slammed his hand on the table, demanding immediate retaliation, hit them hard. The order was issued with the speed of instinct, but for the first time, the room did not respond as usual. No one jumped in to confirm. No one immediately offered plans. A silence appeared, short but enough to say everything, because every choice at this point had a price, and that price was no longer just a few targets destroyed. It was the risk of opening a war that America was no longer sure it could control. The generals began to speak, not to push for attack, but to warn that if they struck deep into Iranian territory, they would receive a larger, faster, harder to stop wave of missiles in return. Not only Israel, but the entire U.S. base system in the region would be in the crosshairs. The Strait of Hormuz could be closed, oil prices could explode, global supply chains could be strangled, and then the story would no longer be confined to the Middle East. Trump wanted to retaliate, but for the first time he was forced to calculate. Emergency orders were issued. U.S. fleets in the region accelerated and dispersed formation. Fighter jets took off from aircraft carriers. THAAD and Patriot systems were raised to the highest alert level. Evacuation plans for non-essential personnel in Israel and the Gulf were activated. Rescue helicopters flew in the night around the burning ships, pulling survivors out of the sea of flames. But all those actions shared one common point. They were reactions, no longer proactive, no longer the ones writing the script. America in that moment became the side chasing events. In Tel Aviv, the situation was no better. Emergency meetings continued in the bunkers. The cabinet was divided. One side demanded immediate retaliation, striking deep into Iran to regain the initiative. The other side warned that any hasty move could turn the entire region into a total war battlefield. No more confident statements, no more images of impregnability, only one question repeating: if they continue striking, can we withstand it? Israeli citizens watched the live images. Bases burning, aircraft destroyed, black smoke covering the sky. That was not a distant battlefield. It was right inside their territory, right in the places once considered the safest. The panic came not only from the damage, but from the realization that the opponent no longer fought in the old way, no longer circled, no longer tested. Iran had struck directly, struck quickly, struck at the right places, and most importantly, they did not stop after one blow. In Washington, reports continued to pour in: casualties at sea, initial damage assessments at the bases on the performance of defense systems, and one repeated line in many analyses: Iran's reaction was faster than predicted, more accurate than predicted, more effective than predicted. That was what made everything dangerous, not because America lacked the ability to respond, but because they were no longer sure they were facing an opponent that could be forced back with the old style of strikes. Trump appeared before the public with tough rhetoric condemning Iran and promising they would pay the price. But those words no longer carried the same weight as before, because the world had just witnessed the opposite. America struck first, but Iran was the one creating the real shock. And in every command center, one question began to spread. Not, can we strike back, but how far do we dare to strike? That was when the balance truly changed. Not on the map, not in the numbers, but in the minds of those making the decisions. When every move carried enormous risk, when every choice could trigger an even stronger reaction, then the side holding the initiative was not the stronger side, but the side that made the opponent hesitate. And Iran had achieved that in just a few hours. With just two strikes, they not only caused damage, they pulled Washington and Tel Aviv into a situation where every next step was a gamble. The White House was suffocating not because of lack of strength, but because for the first time in a long while they had to face a reality. That strength no longer guaranteed immediate victory. And when that happened, every order, no matter how loudly shouted, could not erase the truth that the game had changed its rules. Iran had flipped the chessboard from a pressured target into the one determining the game. While Washington was still fumbling between two choices, both smelling of risk, on the other side, Tehran maintained a completely different state. No panic, no haste, no uncontrolled flurry of actions, only a silence heavy as steel. The silence of someone who had finished calculating their moves and knew exactly where the opponent was trapped. Iran did not need to prove anything more with words. What they needed to say had already been written in fire on American ship hulls and in the Israeli sky. What remained was for the opponent to understand for themselves, and what the opponent was understanding right now was the most dangerous thing. Iran was no longer a pressured target, but had become the one forcing others to react to its rhythm. Look at how Tehran orchestrated this entire chain of events. They did not immediately counterattack when Tuska was shot. They waited not because they were weak, but because they needed the right moment. A moment when their strike would not only cause damage, but also create the greatest psychological effect when Washington had just declared victory. When Trump was still enjoying the moment of show of force, that was exactly when Iran struck, and they did not strike once. They struck two blows in succession in two different spaces within a time frame so short that the reaction systems of the US and Israel could not adapt in time. The Gulf of Oman burned, Israel shook with no pause, no recovery rhythm. That was not an outburst, that was design. This was the core difference. For many years, the West had viewed Iran as a passive, reactive opponent that had to endure pressure and find ways to defend. But what had just happened completely reversed that image. Iran did not just take the blow. Iran chose to take the blow to open an opportunity for a counterblow at a higher level, a way of thinking that was no longer defense but orchestration. And what made Washington most uncomfortable was not the physical damage, but the fact that they had been pulled into exactly the situation Iran wanted. America fired first, but then had to fumble for the next path. Israel possessed superior technology, but was placed on the defensive right on its own territory. Meanwhile, Iran, the nation once isolated, sanctioned, and always seen as having to defend, had become the one setting the pace. That was the power shift. Not noisy, but extremely clear. Many years of sanctions had not weakened Iran the way Washington had hoped. On the contrary, they had forced Tehran to adapt, to develop on its own, to prepare for the worst scenarios. And when that moment came, they were not caught by surprise. They stepped into it as part of the plan. The Hwasong-18 was not just a missile, it was the result of an accumulation process in technology, tactics, and timing. And when it was launched, it carried not only the warhead, but also a message that Washington could not ignore. Iran was ready to play at the level that previously only superpowers had dared to touch. This explained why Tehran's response showed no signs of excess. They did not unleash their entire force, did not fire indiscriminately, did not expand the battlefield uncontrollably. They struck enough to shock, enough to expose weaknesses, enough to force the opponent to rethink all old assumptions. That was how a confident nation acted, not needing to prove by quantity, only by effectiveness. And the effectiveness was all too clear. In just a few hours, Iran had achieved what many years of confrontation had not. Forcing America to slow down, forcing Israel to look at itself, and forcing the entire region to admit that the balance of power was no longer the same. What was worth noting was that Tehran had not yet played all its cards. What had just happened was only part of the capabilities they possessed, and it was precisely that unused portion that was the strongest deterrent, because the opponent did not know where the limit lay. In war, the greatest fear is not what you see, but what you have not seen but know for sure exists. Iran had created exactly that state. No need to show off, no need to say much, only a series of actions that were compact enough, deep enough, and timed precisely enough to make the opponent ask themselves questions. If they go one step further, what will the price be? And when the opponent starts asking themselves that, it means the initiative has changed hands. The chessboard shook when the world realized America was no longer immune to retaliation. Smoke had not yet cleared over the Gulf of Oman. Fires had not yet been extinguished in the Negev. The aftershocks of that night had spread far beyond the scope of a single military clash. It struck directly at what had shaped the Middle East order for decades: the belief that America could always act without paying a proportionate price. And in just a few hours, that belief began to crack. In Moscow, watchful eyes did not need to say much. Every burning American warship meant reduced pressure on other fronts. Every time Israel's defense system was penetrated was a signal that the Western shield was no longer as tight as they had claimed. Without direct intervention, the mere fact that Washington was pulled into a hard to control situation in the Middle East was already a clear strategic advantage. In Beijing, the view was even colder. This was not just a regional event, this was a real world test. If a country like Iran could penetrate the multi layered defense systems of America and Israel, if they could hit mobile naval targets and fix bases in the same breath, then the question was no longer in the Middle East. It shifted elsewhere. In larger scenarios, could America really protect its allies when facing more modern, faster, more complex missile systems? And in the Gulf, where reliance on Washington's security umbrella was almost absolute, psychology began to change, not publicly, but clearly enough to feel. When two American destroyers were hit right in the area they controlled, when Israeli bases, America's closest partner, could not escape the fire, the question naturally arose: if that could happen to them, who could it happen to tomorrow? Secret phone calls began to increase. Unofficial communication channels were activated, not to confront, but to prevent. In the new world taking shape, relying solely on one single superpower was no longer an absolutely safe option. And Iran, from a position of isolation, suddenly became a variable that no one could ignore. In Europe, the concern had a different color, not the battlefield, but the consequences. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's energy choke point, suddenly became more fragile than ever. Just one mistaken escalation step and oil flows could be strangled. Energy prices would not only rise, but explode. And then what happened in the Middle East would immediately spread to economies already under strain. But what drew the most attention from global analysts was not the numbers, but the structure that for decades had operated the Middle East on three pillars: American military superiority, Israeli technological superiority, and Iran's isolation. That night, all three pillars shook at the same time. America was still strong, but no longer immune. Israel was still advanced, but no longer impregnable. And Iran, the nation once forced into a defensive position, had now stepped forward as an actor capable of shaping the game. This was not a complete reversal, but it was a turning point, a point from which onward every strategic calculation had to be rewritten. And what made Washington most uncomfortable was the speed of this change. Not after a prolonged war, not after years of attrition, but in just a few hours, one decision to open fire, one chain of reactions, and the entire perceptual structure was shaken. Iran did not need to declare victory. They did not need to show off their forces any further. What they needed had already happened. They had forced the whole world to reconsider how they were evaluated. No longer a restrained regional opponent, but an entity capable of direct retaliation with speed and effectiveness that made even the great powers pause. And when an opponent forces you to pause, it means they have crossed a very different threshold. Not the threshold of absolute power, but the threshold sufficient to change the way you think before you act. That night, the chessboard was not overturned, but rotated by an angle. And in the great games, sometimes just a small angle like that is enough to change the entire situation. The rest now no longer lies in who is stronger, but in who understands faster that the rules of the game have changed. 72 fateful hours. Next will be retreat or burning the entire region. Smoke still rose from the Gulf of Oman. The blackened ship hulls had not yet cooled. In the Negev, fires still smoldered inside bases once considered impregnable. But the most terrifying thing was not what had already happened. It lay in what was about to happen. In the next 72 hours, the short period before the official ceasefire agreement hit bottom, the period in which every decision could push the entire region across a point of no return, Washington now stood before two doors, and neither led to safety. If Trump chose retaliation not as a symbolic strike, but as a real campaign, he would trigger a larger response from Tehran. No longer a few missiles, no longer limited strikes, but a wave that could sweep across the entire U.S. base system in the region, pulling in familiar names like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and turning the Strait of Hormuz into a vital choke point for the global economy. A comprehensive regional war with no limits, no gray zones. But if he chose restraint, the price was no less heavy. The silence after such a strike would be seen as weakness not only by the opponent, but by its own allies. A superpower that did not respond when its forces were hit would lose something more important than weapons, credibility. And once that credibility wavered, every alliance built upon it would begin to crack. Israel was also trapped in the same vice. Continuing to strike, they could trigger a chain of escalation that their defense system had just proven was not perfect. Stopping, they had to accept a painful reality. Their territory was no longer immune to Iran's long-range fire. One choice was military risk, the other was strategic risk. There was no easy path. And on the other side, Tehran did not need to hurry. They had already achieved the most important thing, forcing the opponent to think. Every hour that passed without a decision from Washington increased the pressure, not pressure from Iran, but pressure from within America itself, from allies, from markets, from the consequences that any move could bring. Iran did not need to fire more to exert pressure. Their silence at this moment was already heavy enough. This was the point where the game shifted from firepower to psychology, no longer about who had more missiles, but who dared to accept the price of the next step. Iran had proven they were willing to pay the price to retaliate. The question now shifted to the American side. How much were they willing to pay to regain the initiative? The coming hours would not only decide a military response, they would shape how the world viewed American power for many years to come. If Washington struck hard and controlled the escalation, they might regain some of their prestige. But if that strike triggered a chain reaction they could not extinguish, the consequences would spread far beyond the Middle East. Conversely, if they retreated, they might avoid a major war, but the price would be a crack in the superpower image that would not be easy to repair. Between those two choices, there was no perfect option, only the one less dangerous in the short term and more dangerous in the long term. And that was the greatest achievement of Tehran in the night just past. Not the number of ships hit, not the number of bases destroyed, but the fact that they had pulled the opponent into a situation where every choice carried risk, where the opponent had to weigh every step, calculate every scenario, meaning they were no longer free to act as before. The next 72 hours would answer a question the whole world was waiting for. Would Washington accept the new reality and adjust, or would it try to break it with a bigger strike? Would Tel Aviv tighten its defenses or plunge into a spiral of retaliation with no escape? And Iran, after delivering strikes sufficient to shake the chessboard, would continue without limits or stop at the point already achieved. The answer had not yet appeared, but one thing was clear. The Middle East of yesterday no longer existed. A new, more dangerous, more unpredictable order was forming from those very columns of smoke still rising over the sea and in the desert. And when the smoke cleared, what remained would not only be the burned ships or the destroyed bases. What remained was a truth no one could avoid. The game had changed its rules, and from now on, every move would have a price.